Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. One of the skills that every person needs to learn is how to find good advice, how to listen to it, and how to follow it. And today, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, which is a key chapter about wise living. Now, if you don't have a copy of our key chapter list, you can get that on our website. But if you don't have it and you're just kind of going along with this, you might be surprised to find us jumping in Ecclesiastes all the way here in chapter 12. What happened to the first 11 chapters? Well, you'll remember that this study is going through the key chapters of God's Word, one chapter per day. And since there are almost 1,200 chapters in the Bible, it means we're going to have to just skip out a bunch. And I'd love for us to spend more time in the book of Ecclesiastes. But for now, we'll just have time to look at chapter 12, in part because this is a summary chapter of the entire book. This is basically the conclusions that Solomon draws after just pursuing all kinds of different things, trying to find out how to find meaning and satisfaction in life. And so as we look at this chapter here, if we looked at the entire book, it would feel very familiar to what we've been reading in the book of Proverbs. After all, it's basically the same author, Solomon. And back in chapter 1, although of course we're skipping all of that, but chapter 1, verse 1, it says that this book was written by a son of David called the preacher. And traditionally, this is just held to be Solomon, who is a wise teacher, just instructing us as almost like we're just his pupils and giving us good advice. And this book is about wise living with a lot of wise views on life. But unlike Proverbs, by and large, this is not a book of principles that are boiled down into like these short Instagram-like posts. This is something more along the lines of a personal journal where Solomon records his thoughts about wise living and just tells what he did to pursue wise living. Now, the premise of this book goes all the way back to chapter 1 also. Back in chapter 1, verse 2, Solomon sees that life, by and large, is meaningless. He uses this word vanity. He's just like, it's just meaningless. I don't get it. What's all this about? And so he asks in verse 3 of chapter 1, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? In other words, in all that we do, why does any of it matter? Well, Solomon is troubled by this, as really everybody is if we really let these questions weigh on us. And so he sets out in life trying to figure out what gives life meaning, what gives life joy and happiness. And so from chapter 2 onward, he gives us this kind of poetical, journalistic account of what he was pursuing about trying to live life well. And these here in chapter 12 are his final conclusions. So let's go through this chapter and see what kind of advice Solomon gives to us about wise living. The first conclusion is in verses 1 to 8. And this is just the principle of being spiritually prepared before the storms of life hit. You see, life brings challenges. If nothing else, as we're just kind of looking at these verses here, getting older is not easy. I'm 48. I've lived long enough to see how age affects our life and our thinking. We can't do what we once did. The marketing of the world is to younger folks. We've been kind of passed over. There are biological or hormonal changes going on. And although it's not literally too late to begin pursuing the Lord, the person who starts getting serious about the Lord at this point in life has a lot of ground to make up. And here's why. When you look at the kind of events that this first section of chapter 12 talks about, Solomon warns that difficulties will come and we will find God's grace if we are already prepared to meet them by walking with him. And so Solomon gives this summary of the kinds of things we might face in life. Evil days will come. We won't be delighting in life anymore. We'll have fears and famine, mental sluggishness, financial distress, even death. And when we're walking with the Lord before these events happen, we'll be walking with him through them. We will learn to see his presence. We will learn to trust him. We will learn to recognize his fingerprints in the events of life, and we'll be growing in our devotion to him, being strengthened by him, so that when we face these kinds of situations, these kinds of trials, we're not derailed by them. We're like that house that Jesus talks about in Matthew 7, where the storms come, but we still stand. And if we are walking with the Lord before these events happen, the Lord will often guide us to go through those challenges in a way that just produces wisdom and meaning, and we'll even see good coming out of them. And so the way to be prepared for life's challenges is to walk with the Lord before they come. And that means starting on out we see here in our youth, before these challenges come, where we are learning to walk with Christ so that as we go through life, we'll be prepared for the challenges that come our way. Now, I know that we have a number of families who are listening to this podcast. And even I just checked the statistics for our audience listenership, and we've got a really healthy percentage of people who are listening who are under 22 years old. And if that's you, thanks so much for being a part of this. And let me just say to you and to any person who is young, ultimately anybody listening to this, but if you're a young person and you're just wondering about following the Lord, if you're maybe like listening, just checking on in, maybe you just kind of dropped into this podcast from out of nowhere, Following Jesus is not something that old people do. I mean, yeah, they do, but it's not for old people. It's not like, well, let me just kind of live life in the world for a while, and then when I get too old to do anything else, let me then turn to the Lord. That's not how it works with things of God. Now, God is gracious. If we come to him later in life, he'll be there to meet with us and strengthen us in those times. But the wise life, the wise person seeks to walk with the Lord even from their youth. When you think about the heroes of our faith, by and large, they were young men and women, like David, or Daniel, or Mary, or even all of the disciples, except for Peter. Pretty much all of the disciples, and Daniel and David and Mary, they were all under the age of 20 when we read about their life-defining faith and courage. These were young folks taking God seriously and then walking with him throughout the rest of their life. And so while time does help us grow and deepen in our understanding of the Lord, we can start right now, no matter what age we are. Along those lines, when I was in my teens and early 20s, I kept a journal of life. I came to Christ after high school, and so when I came to the Lord, it just was all so new, and there's so much just to take on in and absorb. And I just found that it was really a struggle just to live my life in fellowship with God. The other day, I was reading part of my journal from those days, and I was stunned by how discouraged I was during those days and how much despair I had during that time. And if you were to read what I wrote 25, 30 years ago, you'd be like, hey, you know what? This dude's just going to end up walking away from the Lord because my questions were so dark. I was questioning everything. I was just struggling so deeply. But here I am, a pastor 30 years later, and have none of those questions anymore. Well, what happened? Well, the reason is those questions were answered as I walked with the Lord. I was asking tough questions. I was asking kinds of questions that are of a deep spiritual nature. And so the answers were going to be tough answers. The answers were going to be spiritual in nature as well. And I was going to have to learn to walk with the Lord and obey him to find the answers. In fact, God often won't give the answers we're seeking until we come to him with a heart of obedience. And so we can't really put God to the test and say, I won't obey you until I get these answers. It goes the other way around. Let me walk with you, let me obey you, and let me find you'll give answers along the way. And so if you're young and discouraged, I would just encourage you to hold on to the Lord. Commit your life to fully obeying him in every detail, every domain. You will find that he is true and real and an ever-present person in your life, and he will lead you and guide you down a path that is according to his will, brings him glory, and ultimately you joy and meaning as well. And so this all brings us back now to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, where Solomon is just calling us to be wise and to follow the Lord even when we're young. Prepare now for the challenges that lay ahead. God will be with you in those days coming up tomorrow. Prepare now, and he'll walk with you as you go through them. Well, let's go on to verses 9 to 14, the final section of this whole book. In verses 9 and 10, Solomon talks about how he pursued knowledge and wisdom, and he shows us the value of wisdom in verse 11, saying, the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. And so we should be listening to the wise sayings of godly people. When you find a person who has been on fire for Christ for decades, listen to what that person has to say. And here's the value of learning wise words. At times we see here that they will be like goads that keep us going in the right direction. Now, a goad is basically a stick that a rancher would use, just kind of tap his animals and guide them down the paths he wants them to go down. And so a wise saying is kind of like a little tap against our heart to guide us down God's path of wisdom for our life. And verse 11 also promises that when we learn to master proverbs or wise sayings, we will be like well-driven nails. Now, that's just the idea that when you're building something and you want to hold it all together, especially back then, they'd use nails. Didn't really have modern screws back then, so kind of nails is what they had to use. And when they would place those nails in the right places and drive them nicely and solidly into that wood, everything would hold together. And so Solomon is saying in verse 11, when we learn these things and follow them and apply them to our life, we're going to find that all of these pieces hold together. Again, we're that house that survives the storm. And verse 11 even says all of this is given by one shepherd. This is God's ways of guiding us. These are the things he wants us to learn. And as we take him up on his word and follow him, we will find that our life holds together with joy and meaning and value in life. But as we go on in this chapter here, then Solomon warns in verse 12 that we need to be careful about what we're taking in. He warns about just the multitude of books that are out there. There are, even back then, all kinds of books written on all kinds of subjects. Much of it's not devoted to the Lord. Much of it's not even true. And when you think about all of the books that have been written throughout history, if you look at them, I mean, there's so many that have been written. Most of them aren't followed or respected even 5 years later. They were written, printed, somebody read them at some point, but now what they're saying has no meaning or value for today. We could spend all of our time reading these kinds of books and find out just years later, wow, that was a waste of 5 hours it took me to read that book. Of course, we need to be wise. And so just as we need to be wise about life, we need to be wise about the things we're taking in. Like, for instance, it's easy to get caught up in the internet, right? I mean, you can spend an entire evening reading about stuff that literally won't matter tomorrow. We live in the information age, but so much of this information is meaningless. And verse 12 warns us that we can wear ourselves out trying to keep up with it all. There are many times that we're just suffering heartaches in life because we're literally ignoring this instruction here, just to guard what we take in and not become weary trying to be consumed with the latest new factoids of information. Well, as this book comes to a close, we then come to the final words of Solomon that are really the keys to this entire book, and that's in verses 13 and 14. He says, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. Now why? Well, verse 14 says, for God will bring every act into judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And so, at the end of the day, the wisest course of life is one that fears God. We saw this a few days ago when we were in Proverbs chapter 1, that fearing God means to listen to him, learn his ways, know that he is part of our life, know that we're accountable to him, and live in light of these truths. And so verse 13 summarizes fearing God as just keeping his commandments. And we saw in Psalm 119 that there are incredible promises and blessings that are for those who follow the commandments of God and keep to his instruction. The wise person lives in light of those promises, and they find that indeed God is faithful to those who fear him and obey him. And so all of the things that Solomon has been talking about in this book, of course, we did skip over them, but things like the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of wealth, or the pursuit of status or power or success, all of that is meaningless unless God is at the center of our lives and unless what we're doing is being done out of obedience and worship to him and fellowship with him. And so when it comes down to a life that is well lived, this is a great path for all of us. Walk with God from a young age. Pursue learning God's wisdom. Avoid the world's false and fleeting wisdom, and obey God in everything. And when we pursue a life like this, we will walk a path guided by God, filled with his presence, and avoiding a life that is meaningless, stagnant, a life of despair. And so as we wrap up this passage, I know we've gone through Ecclesiastes super fast, that one day does not do this book justice. And so if you have some more time, maybe just glance over the other chapters that we skipped. If you have only a little bit of time, I'd encourage you to look at chapters 5 through 12, although the whole book is just great material. But those are just the chapters I have most underlined, and when you just look at them, there's just such practical wisdom for life in those pages. Well, we'll leave things there. I look forward to catching you tomorrow as we turn to an entirely new section of God's Word as we look at the prophets, starting Isaiah chapter 1. It's a great book. I'm looking forward to going through it with you. Until then, hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening. God bless.